The 10 Blowers by Abbie Farwell Brown. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 10 Blowers. Once upon a time, there was a fat miller who lived in the land of windmills. Now that is a queer country, where the people look queer, talk and live and dress queerly, and where queer things are likely to happen at any time. So you must not be surprised if this should be a queer tale of the miller and his mill and his family. But you must take my queer word for it that the happenings were all queerly true as I shall tell them. The miller was a thoughtful fellow, as the folk of the land of windmills are apt to be, and he had ideas. When his first son was born, he sat down and thought for a long time. His baby had fine lungs. He cried louder and longer than any baby of whom the miller had ever heard, so that the father had to go out of doors to think. "He is a very remarkable child," said the miller to himself. "His talents in the way of lung power are extraordinary. They must be developed. I believe in deciding as soon as possible what a child shall be according to his earliest inclinations. With his fine lungs he must become a blower of some kind, a musician, perhaps a cornetter or a flutist, but we can decide that later. I shall begin to train him immediately." So the miller trained the lungs of his son. His first gift to the baby was an ivory whistle, and the little fellow soon learned to blow it so that his mother was nearly deafened. When he grew stronger he had a penny trumpet, and then there was a racket, to be sure. But the more noise he made, the more were the miller and his good wife delighted, for they said to each other, "What wonderful talents has our son! Surely he will become a great blowing musician in the days that are to be." Before he was a year old, Hans could blow a little bugle so loudly that all the dogs of the neighborhood would rush to the house and surround it, barking. But he made no tunes on the bugle, only noise. Not long after this came a little brother for Hans, and this baby showed the same talent as the first one, by day and by night, filling the cottage with his sturdy bellows. You might think that this would have disturbed the peace of the miller and his wife, who could get no sleep at all. But no, indeed, they were twice delighted. "Look now," they said, "we shall have 2 little blowers in the family. Perhaps a flute and a trombone. Perhaps a cornet and a fife. Who knows?" And they began to put Pete through the same training that Hans had received, which was very pleasant for the little brothers, as you can imagine. There was no crying of, "Oh, children, don't make such a racket," in that house. There was no hiding of whistles and trumpets and bugles. When one noisy toy wore out, they were immediately given a new one, for fear that they should forget how to blow. And they played at nothing else all day long but blowing and blowing and blowing. The house was so noisy that the neighbors did not often visit the miller's wife, but she cared nothing at all for that. Then another baby came, and as the years went by, more little brothers blessed the miller's cottage, each with the same wonderful lung power, the same puffy cheeks, the same fondness for blowing, till before the miller fairly had counted them all, he found himself sitting at the head of a table around which 10 little blowers kicked their heels and blew on their porridge to cool it. Now 10 little blowers, each blowing all day long for dear life, have 10 big appetites, and the miller had hard work to supply them with food. The children were not helping him by earning money. Oh no, they were too busy blowing, practicing on the flutes, trombones, trumpets, bugles, fifes, horns, oboes, cornets, bassoons, and piccolos, which their father had bought them, hoping that they would be musicians. But it was very strange. Although they were becoming skillful indeed at making a loud noise, they had never yet made any music. The more they practiced, the further they seemed to be from any tune. When they all got together and blew their instruments as hard as they could, you cannot imagine a more wonderful noise than that which they produced. They could blow the panes out of the windows, and the leaves from the trees, but they could not make the least little tune to save their lives. At last the poor miller saw that they never would make any tune, because there was no music in them, not in one of them. They could never be musicians, though they were wonderful blowers. You see, unless they could blow tunes on their instruments, no one would ever pay merely to hear them blow. Indeed, nowadays folk seldom ventured near the mill, the family made such a din. And this blew trade away, even on windy days. The miller was growing poorer and poorer, and it seemed unlikely that his children would ever help him earn their bread, for they had been brought up to blow, and that was all they knew how to do. One morning the miller went out to grind some grain which Farmer Huss had left the night before. Huss, who was stone deaf, was the only neighbor who cared nowadays to come to the noisy mill, and naturally the miller was anxious to please him. But when he looked up at the cloudless sky, he saw that there would be no grinding done that morning. There was no breeze anywhere, and the mill was sound asleep. The windmill was lazy, like all its race, and unless an urging wind was blowing it, it would not work at all. On breezeless days the mill slept from morning until night, and then the farmers who had brought their grain grumbled and were angry with the poor miller, which of course was very unreasonable. Farmer Huss had vowed that if his grain was not ground before noon, he would never come near the miller again. And that would be bad indeed, for deaf though he was, he remained the miller's best customer. Worst of all, there was not a crust in the house, not a penny to buy bread, and although the children were now so busy blowing that they had forgotten to be hungry, before night they would be crying for food. What was to be done? Hollow-eyed with hunger and anxiety, the miller sat down and stared at the motionless mill. Something must be done. Unless the children could help him earn a penny, he must sell their flutes, trombones, trumpets, bugles, fifes, horns, oboes, cornets, bassoons, and piccolos. But what then would become of their wonderful talent for blowing? Must all their practice be wasted? Thought the miller. They have blown until their breath is as strong as the wind. Ha! I have an idea. And jumping up, he ran as fast as his legs would carry him to gather his little flock. "It is an ill babe that blows no good," said the miller to himself. The miller found his boys in the mill yard, blowing on their 10 instruments. Hans the eldest, who was head and shoulders taller than his father, had the huge bassoon, and the baby, who was just able to toddle, grasped a piccolo. All the other brothers, big and little, tall and short, were tootling upon their various instruments, with their cheeks bulging out like balloons, and the noise was so deafening that the bugs and beetles burrowed down into the ground to escape it, while even the fishes in the well turned over on their backs and fainted from the vibrations. Whenever they were hungry, the miller's sons always blew hardest, because then they forgot about their empty stomachs. Although it was a still day, so still that the windmill's arms were quite motionless, when the children blew the notes from their instruments, the smoke about the cottage chimney huddled itself together and scudded horizontally away. The trees swayed as if blown by a tempest, and the waters of the duck pond became humpy with waves, so that the ducks were in danger of drowning. When the miller saw all this, he was delighted, and his face beamed like the sun after a shower. "Good, my children, good!" he cried. "You are wonderful little blowers, and you shall make my fortune yet, though there is not one note of music in the 10 of you. But look you, I have an idea. Gather around me, and I will tell you." The 10 children dropped their instruments and crowded eagerly about the miller, for they hoped that he was going to tell them some way to get a dinner. But instead of this, he led them in a procession straight to the windmill, where it stood lazily holding out its arms for the breeze which did not come. "Look at that lazy windmill," said the miller. "He has ground no meal for a whole day, and we have no money to buy food. Now, children, open your mouths and blow. Blow as hard as you know how, to see whether you cannot blow wind into his sails and make him go." So the 10 boys stood in a row, and at a signal took in a deep breath. When the miller counted 1, 2, 3, they made round mouths and blew out a long breath straight towards the windmill's nearest arm. And lo, instantly the sails filled, and the great windmill spun around like mad, whether it would or no. The miller's idea was wonderful. The children jumped up and down, clapping their hands. Why had they never thought of this before? This was better than blowing instruments. The miller told the children to keep on blowing, and he ran into the mill to fill the hopper with grain. The white flour went sifting into the bags till their sides were plump and firm. In a few moments all the grain was ground, and the miller was on his way to deliver the bags to neighbor Huss. And deaf old Huss was so pleased to have his meal ready before he expected it, that he paid the miller double, promising to call again very soon. So now the miller had money to buy bread for his children, and a fine supper they enjoyed that night, you may be sure. Best of all was that their good luck had come to stay. The children gave up their flutes, trombones, trumpets, bugles, fifes, horns, oboes, cornets, bassoons, and piccolos, because they had decided not to be musicians, but mill-blowers instead, which was a blow to music. After all, they said, their new profession was a more distinguished one, for with practice anyone can blow a blast on a trombone, but few families of 10 have lungs so mighty that they can blow a windmill when it wants to stand still. They practiced and they practiced, before and after school, and they grew so skillful that the miller declared them to be better than any breeze, for they were always ready when he wanted them. On days when no breeze was blowing, and all the other windmills in the land were as quiet as the market on Sunday, then the neighbors flocked to the miller of the wonderful blowing family, and at his mill they were sure of having their grain ground quickly and well. The miller was fast growing rich. He charged double price always, and indeed folk thought it was worth paying double price to see the miller's 10 blowers at their work. They had neat little uniforms of blue and white, like figures on a tile, blue trousers and white miller's smocks and wooden shoes, and they were trained to stand in an orderly row with big Hans at the head and chubby baby Todd at the foot, all puff-cheeked, ruddy, and broad-chested from much blowing, and they blew all together. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, with a sound like a great wind in the chimney on a January night, while the windmill whirled around like a mad thing and seemed ready to blow to pieces. But the onlookers had to be careful to put a rock in their pockets or hold on to something steady, lest they be blown from their feet by the blast which the children blew. Stories of the miller's wonderful family spread far and wide, and many folk came to see the little blowers at their work. They were often asked to show their skill in various ways. Hans might easily have earned his living as a blacksmith's bellows, could his father have spared him from the mill. The village children often coaxed the younger blowers to blow their kites up into the sky, or their sailboats down the canals. Even the baby earned many a penny by blowing the soot out of the cottage chimneys and the dust from the corners of the goodwives' spandy floors. But the miller himself did not encourage all this. "Best stick to your home mill, my sons," he said, "and good will come of it. Do not waste your breath in blowing small things. One day your breath shall blow us into fortune." And this seemed likely to be true, for every day they were becoming more famous and more rich. And all the other millers in the land were so jealous that they could not sleep o' nights. There came a time when the miller was kept busy indeed, and proudly so, for he had been commanded by the king himself to grind 1,000 sacks of flour for the wedding cookery of the young prince his son. The prince was to cross the sea to be married to the daughter of the proud king of Outland, and when he had brought his fair bride home there was to be great rejoicing, feasting and merrymaking at the capital of the land of windmills, and the miller's flour was to make the huge wedding cake and a little cake for each of the guests. For his share in all this preparation, the miller was to receive a great price, a bag of gold. So he hurried about, and the children blew, and the windmill whirled, and dusty flour went pouring into the king's sacks, until all was done. Then the miller sat proudly at the head of his table, surrounded by his proud family, and with the sack of gold in the middle of the board for them to admire. They were eating their goodly supper, and drinking the health of the prince and his bride, for the morrow was to be the wedding day. Every one was talking and laughing under his breath, for they dared not laugh aloud nowadays, for fear of blowing out all the lights. Suddenly there came the galloping of horses' hoofs along the highway, and a thundering knock at the door. "Open!" cried a voice. "A messenger of the king!" The fat miller ran to the door and undid the bolts as fast as he could, while his children crowded around to hear the king's message, but they held their breaths, lest the message be blown away as soon as spoken. There sat a rider on a great black horse, and behind him 11 grooms held 11 horses of different sizes, the smallest one being the prettiest, tiniest white pony you ever saw. "Ho, miller!" shouted the messenger. "I bring the king's command that you and your family of blowers mount and ride with me to the capital, for the king has need of you. I bring steeds for all. Lose no time in obeying the king's message." The miller and his sons were startled and amazed. They could not guess whether for joy or for sorrow they were being thus called to court. But of course there was nothing for them but to obey the king. Quickly they mounted the 11 steeds which the 11 grooms had brought. The fat miller went first, on a fat little brown horse which looked like him, and behind him came long lanky Hans on a long-limbed bay. After him followed Pete on a gallant chestnut, behind whom galloped all the other brothers, with Tod the baby on the tiny white pony bringing up the rear. But the miller's poor wife was left behind, not knowing whether to be sorry or glad because of the king's summons to her family. Nearly all night they galloped, thud, thud, over the quiet roads, past shut-eyed houses and dozy windmills, drowsy canals and dreaming villages, and at early dawn they came to the capital city. Here the tired king himself rode out to meet them, accompanied by a crowd of sleepy soldiers and cross-looking nobles. The miller and his 10 boys slipped from their saddles and knelt in a row before the king, awaiting his commands. But he had no time for ceremony this morning. "Rise," he said impatiently. "Do not kneel there when time is so precious. Rise, and hasten to the seashore, miller. I have heard what wonderful blowers your children are. It is for this reason I have sent for you. Out yonder on the sea lies the ship of my son, the prince, who has sailed for Outland to bring home a bride. Yesterday morn he started, but he has not gone far. My telescopes show that the ship still lies helpless, as she has lain for 12 hours, becalmed, between the windless headlands in the Bay of Calms. The wedding was to have been this morning at 10 in the Outland King's Cathedral. Hasten, miller, he has yet many leagues to go. You and your children must blow the prince into port in season for the ceremony, or his life is lost. For if he be late, even by 5 minutes, the Outland King has bargained that he must die. He is a proud father, she is a proud princess, and must be kept waiting by no one. My word is pledged, my son is in danger. Save the prince, miller, and you shall be made a duke, and all your children earls." The king ceased speaking, and the crowd of nobles hustled the miller and his family down to the shore, whence, far off against the dawn, sharp eyes could dimly see the prince's ship lying on the water, like a leaf on the surface of a calm well. The miller ranged his 10 blowers in a row, as they always stood when about to make the windmill whirl, and they were a flight of steps, one above the other, good to see. Then the miller cried, "Blow, my children, blow with all your might, when I speak the word, for a great matter is at stake. Now, 1, 2, 3. The boys drew in a long breath, puffed their cheeks, let out their breath, expanded their chests, and at the 3rd count blew with all their might, till their eyes bulged and they were purple in the face. The trees bent to the ground, and the birds flew out of their nests, chirping wildly. And soon after this, the watchmen on the palace wall, who were spying at the prince's ship with their telescopes, gave a great cheer. The sails had filled with wind, and the vessel was moving, ever so slowly, towards Outland. "Again, my babes!" roared the miller. 1, 2, 3, and once more a blast blew from the shore, so mighty that the hats of the nobles went flying off into the sea, and the king himself nearly lost his crown of pearls and rubies, which would have been a scandalous thing. Once more the lookouts on the battlements cheered. The prince's ship was moving steadily forward, past the windless headlands, out of the Bay of Calms. "Once more!" shouted the miller, encouraged by the king's nod of delight. "One more blow for our king and prince, my children!" And a 3rd time the 10 filled their lungs and puffed their cheeks in a good cause. This time the watchers danced wildly on the palace walls and waved a golden banner to the king, which was the signal that all was well. For the prince's ship had scudded clean out of sight, straight towards Outland and the bride. Once in the open gulf, the ship was in no further danger of being becalmed. This is how the miller and his 10 saved the life of the prince of the land of windmills, and became very dear to their king. For, aided by the breath of the miller's sons, the prince reached Outland in time. Yes, even with time to spare, the princess was not ready for him. And her father was so pleased by this promptness of the bridegroom, that when the newly married pair left Outland after the grand wedding, they took with them as a gift from the king 100 buckets of silver and 100 buckets of gold and 100 buckets of shining jewels, the most beautiful that ever were seen. So that when the prince reached the land of windmills, he was able to give fine presents to all who had done services for him, and you may be sure that the miller and his boys were not among the last of this number. The miller was made Duke of Millwind, and he received one of the 100 buckets of jewels, while each of the earls, his sons, had one of the buckets of gold, and the miller's wife received one of the buckets of silver, although she had done nothing at all but stay at home and worry. After that there was no longer any need for the miller and his family to weaken themselves with work. They were rich and noble, and now it was fair to give the other millers in the land a chance. But no other miller had so talented a family, you see. The best thing of all was that the prince and princess, who, upon the old king's death, themselves became king and queen, lived to have 10 daughters, each more beautiful than the others, and when they were grown up, the king their father married them to the 10 young earls, the sons of the Duke of Millwind, in token of his gratitude to that fine fat gentleman who was once a miller. And Hans, the eldest son, who married the eldest princess, he who had first shown his talent as a blower, Hans himself became in time king of the land of windmills, which was great fortune for a miller's son, as I think you must agree. So the miller's saying proved true, that they would blow themselves into fortune. Now it was in the reign of this illustrious pair that 2 wonderful inventions were made, squeaker balloons and soap bubbles. They were invented at the command of King Hans, in honor of his first infant, who was born with a perfectly wonderful talent for blowing. End of The 10 Blowers by Abbie Farwell Brown. Read by Maria Casper.